The year was 1945. April bled its gray light over the crumbling towns of western Germany, and the air carried the taste of ash, diesel, and quiet surrender. Roads once paved with order now wept mud and smoke. Horses, carts, boots, everything sank a little, including hope. The American convoy moved slowly through the ruin, engines coughing against the damp morning fog. Somewhere beyond those wrecked roofs, the war was ending. But no one dared believe it yet. Staff Sergeant James Halpern sat in the back of the lead truck, his rifle resting across his knees, his gaze distant. He had fought across France and Belgium, crossed the Rhine with men who'd stopped keeping track of names. Every village looked the same now. Burned doors, hollow-eyed civilians, and silence that made even birds seem guilty for singing. Yet something in this place tugged differently. Maybe it was the smell. Not of cordite, but of something human, bread, smoke, and fear blended together. The convoy halted near a collapsed bridge. The lieutenant barked orders, his voice echoing off the gutted remains of a church tower. "We hold here until the engineers clear the road." The men dismounted, stretching, muttering about cigarettes, about going home. And then, beneath the grumble of engines and boots, came a small sound, fragile as a prayer. Halpern turned. On the far side of the road stood a child. She couldn't have been more than 7, her blonde hair tangled and gray with soot. She wore a dress torn at the sleeves, the hem stiff with dried mud. Her bare feet pressed into the cold earth like she'd forgotten they could move. For a moment, she only stared, at the trucks, the flags, the men with weapons slung low. Then her lips parted. "Sir, Mama can't walk." Her voice carried through the smoke like a bell underwater. A few soldiers turned, uneasy. One of them laughed nervously, muttering. Another one, "Christ, they're everywhere." But Halpern didn't move. The child's eyes weren't pleading in that wild, desperate way he'd come to expect from refugees. They were steady, quiet. She was not begging. She was stating a fact. He stepped down from the truck. Mud clung to his boots as he crossed the ditch. A private called after him, "Sergeant, don't." Orders say no interaction, but the words fell behind him like rain. He stopped a few paces away. "Where's your mother?" he said, his voice low. The girl pointed to a wagon overturned beside a line of dead trees. It looked like it had been shelled. One wheel missing, the side charred. Beside it lay a figure half covered with a wool blanket. A woman, maybe in her 30s, pale as the frost that still clung to the grass. Her leg was wrapped in what looked like the remains of a curtain, soaked dark red. The bandage had not been changed in days. Halpern crouched beside her. Her eyelids fluttered, lips cracked from thirst. She whispered something in German, soft, broken. The girl knelt at her side, pressing a hand to her mother's arm. "Sie kann nicht gehen," she murmured again, her words trembling. "She can't walk." The soldier took off his gloves. He touched the woman's forehead. She burned like coal. His training spoke in his head, contamination, infection, protocol, but the human part of him overrode it. He reached into his pack and drew out his canteen. "Here," he said. The child helped her mother sip. Some of the water spilled down her chin. She coughed weakly, but her eyes opened, meeting his. They were gray. Not the cold gray of resignation, but the kind that held fragments of life not yet surrendered. She whispered something again. "Thank you, maybe, or maybe a name." He didn't ask. Behind him, the lieutenant shouted, "Halpern, back to formation. We're moving." He didn't move. He adjusted the blanket over the woman, pulling it higher to her shoulder. The child watched him carefully, her hands clasped tight, dirt smudged across her cheek like war paint. The camera of history would have missed this moment. The lens of victory rarely paused for compassion. Yet in that bomb-torn meadow time seemed to slow. Around them, the fog rolled low, muffling the sounds of command, muting the sharpness of war. Halpern stood and looked toward the convoy. They were already forming ranks again, engines grumbling like impatient beasts. He turned back to the child. "What's your name?" "Lena," she said. "And her?" "Anna." He nodded. "I'll get help." She shook her head immediately. No one comes. They shoot. He froze. The words were not dramatized. They were hollow, practiced, spoken by someone who had seen it. The last village, perhaps. The wrong uniform, the wrong language. To a child, the flags changed but the fear stayed the same. He glanced toward the road again. The convoy had started moving. His name echoed from the distance, swallowed by the wind. War had taught him how to ignore cries, how to detach, how to measure survival by orders and maps. But something inside him, something untouched by discipline, refused to let go. He knelt again, unbuckled his pack, and began to work. From a field kit he drew sulfa powder, a strip of cloth, a needle and thread. The wound was deep, festering, the smell sharp. He cleaned it, wrapped it fresh, ignoring the sting of conscience whispering, "This is not your mission." The girl watched every move, eyes wide. "Will Mama die?" she whispered. He didn't answer. The sky cracked open with the distant echo of artillery. Somewhere east, someone else's battle continued. But here, on this road, the war narrowed down to 3 souls and one impossible choice. When he was done, he helped the woman sip again from his canteen, then looked around. The wagon was useless. He needed to move her. He scanned the landscape. An abandoned farmhouse stood about half a mile away, its roof half-caved but walls intact. "Lena," he said. "We're taking her there." The child's eyes widened. "But how?" He slung his rifle behind his back and slid his arms beneath the woman. She weighed less than she should have, bones and trembling warmth. As he lifted her, she gasped, clutching his sleeve, then fainted again. The girl stumbled beside him, clutching her mother's shawl. They moved slowly through the wet grass. The smoke from the village blurred the horizon. Every step echoed louder than gunfire. For a moment, Halpern imagined someone might be watching, from the treeline, from a ruined window, wondering why an American soldier was carrying a German woman through no man's land. He reached the farmhouse, its door hanging crooked. Inside, dust floated through beams of gray light. A table lay overturned, and a kettle rusted in the ashes of what had once been a hearth. He laid the woman on a straw mat, covered her with his own coat. The girl knelt again, smoothing her mother's hair. Halpern stood in the doorway, his breath heavy, his uniform streaked with mud and blood. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. He turned back to her. "Stay quiet," he said. "I'll bring supplies." Lena nodded, eyes glimmering with a strange mix of trust and disbelief. When he stepped outside, he paused. The convoy was gone. Only the sound of engines fading down the road, and the wind through ruined trees. He was alone now, off record, off orders, off everything that defined him as a soldier. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling around his face like a question he didn't want to answer. He thought of home, of his mother in Illinois who still wrote letters asking if he'd been eating well. He thought of his brother who never made it past Normandy. And he thought of this woman, this child, this fragile piece of mercy in a collapsing world. He crushed the cigarette under his boot. Somewhere deep in the fog, a single artillery shell burst, distant, tired, like the last heartbeat of the dying war. Halpern went back inside. The woman was breathing faintly, her lips moving in sleep. The girl sat beside her, eyes heavy but awake. When she looked up at him, something wordless passed between them, a kind of silent agreement that none of them could yet explain. He knelt down, checked the bandage again, then sat against the cold wall, rifle across his knees. The farmhouse creaked. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of a distant church bell, one that had somehow survived everything else. The girl finally spoke. "Are you going to leave?" He looked at her, then at the sleeping woman, then out toward the empty road. He didn't answer. Instead, he adjusted his rifle, leaned his head back, and whispered, almost to himself, "Not yet." And somewhere beyond that ruined horizon, another command car was already looking for the missing sergeant. Dawn seeped into the ruined farmhouse like a slow confession, pale and cold. The war had thinned the sun. Even its light seemed rationed now. James Halpern woke to the sound of quiet breathing. The German woman lying where he had left her, and the little girl curled against her side like a heartbeat that refused to stop. His coat covered them both. He could feel the chill crawling through the stone floor, the stiffness in his knees, the guilt already whispering. Outside, crows stirred among the broken rafters, their wings the color of gunmetal. He rose carefully, rubbing his neck, and stepped outside. The world beyond the doorway was silvered with fog. Smoke still rose from the town they'd passed yesterday, soft tendrils marking where homes had been, where orders had been carried out too well. He lit a cigarette, though his hands trembled slightly as he did. The match flared against the mist like a memory of warmth. His rations were nearly gone. 2 biscuits, half a tin of beans, a handful of morphine tablets he wasn't supposed to have. His radio still silent. No orders since last night, no coordinates. The army was moving faster than its conscience, advancing east, leaving pockets of ruin and uncertainty behind. He exhaled smoke and watched it fade, thinking of his platoon somewhere miles ahead, laughing, maybe, or already fighting again. Inside, the girl stirred. "Mama?" she murmured. Halpern flicked the cigarette away and re-entered the dim room. The woman was awake now, her eyes cloudy with fever but alert enough to focus on him. She tried to sit, failed, and grimaced in pain. He knelt beside her. "Easy," he said, voice low, even though she couldn't understand him. She spoke in German, words that sounded like apologies or gratitude. He shook his head. "Save your strength." The girl crawled to her mother's side. "She says thank you," she whispered in a careful accent. Halpern looked at her, surprised. "You speak English?" "A little," she said shyly. "Papa taught me. Before." Her words broke off like a radio losing signal. He nodded once, solemnly. "That's good." The woman's hand reached toward his, trembling. Her skin was too hot. He checked the bandage on her leg. The infection had spread. He'd done what he could with what little he had, but without real medical attention, she wouldn't last long. He looked at the wound, then at the girl, and then at the door again. He could almost hear his lieutenant's voice. "Leave it, soldier. We're not medics. Move forward." The decision pressed against his chest like a bayonet. By afternoon, he could hear engines, jeeps grinding through mud, voices in English. He stepped outside, heart tightening. A patrol convoy emerged from the mist, 3 jeeps marked with white stars. The lead vehicle stopped short when it saw him. "Halpern!" a familiar voice barked. It was Lieutenant Mason, square-jawed, efficient, his uniform too clean for the road. "Where the hell have you been?" Halpern saluted automatically. "Had to tend to civilians, sir." Mason's gaze hardened. "You what?" He stepped closer, boots slapping against the wet ground. "You were ordered to regroup at Remagen. We've been searching all morning." "There's a wounded woman," Halpern said evenly. "German civilian, and her child. Couldn't leave them to die." Mason's face twisted between anger and disbelief. "We're soldiers, Halpern, not the Red Cross. You disobeyed orders and went off-grid with enemy nationals in restricted territory. Do you know what that means?" Halpern didn't answer. He didn't have to. Mason exhaled sharply, signaling the men behind him. "Get them out. We'll report this." Halpern stepped in front of the doorway. "She's hurt. She won't survive the move." "She's a German," Mason snapped. "Our priority is moving east. You think command cares about one civilian when we've got entire towns starving? You think she's special?" Something broke quietly in Halpern's expression. "No," he said. "That's why I couldn't walk away." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The fog thickened around them, swallowing the road, the sound of engines, even reason itself. Mason's jaw tightened. "You're risking a court-martial." "I know." Mason studied him for another beat, then turned to his men. "Search the place." The soldiers moved toward the door. Inside, the girl cried out, clutching her mother. Halpern stepped forward, but Mason caught his arm. "Don't make this worse, Jim. Orders are orders." The girl's small voice carried through the ruined walls. "Please, sir. Mama can't walk." The words froze everyone. The same words he had heard yesterday on the road. Mason's hand loosened, just slightly. One of the privates hesitated in the doorway. The woman coughed, weakly, and the sound seemed to echo far beyond the farmhouse. Halpern said nothing. He only watched. After a long silence, Mason gestured. "Fine. Leave them here. But you!" He jabbed a finger into Halpern's chest. "You're coming back to base. We'll sort this mess there." Halpern's jaw clenched. "I can't. You don't have a choice. I made one already." Mason's eyes narrowed, searching his face for the soldier he used to know. "You're a good man, Halpern," he said quietly. "Don't let this war make you stupid." Halpern met his gaze, voice steady. "Maybe stupid's all that's left that still feels human." Something flickered behind Mason's eyes. Pity, or maybe fatigue. And then he turned away. "You've got till sundown," he said finally. "Then we move. If you're not with us, you're on your own." When the jeeps left, the silence that followed was heavier than artillery. Halpern went back inside. The girl's eyes were red from crying, but she looked up at him with the same quiet trust as before. "Are we going?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not yet." The woman was sleeping again, shallow breaths rattling her chest. He sat beside her, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. "You're not dying here," he murmured, more to himself than her. He opened his field radio, tried again to reach anyone. Static. He turned the dial, desperate. For a moment, through the crackle, a voice came, distant, fragmented. "Allied evacuation. Remagen wounded civilians too." Then silence. The rest was gone, swallowed by distance. He looked toward the window, where the fog had thinned into golden light. Somewhere beyond the trees, the world was still burning. But the war felt smaller here, reduced to one woman, one child, and the man who refused to abandon them. By evening, he found the strength to build a small fire. The girl sat close, eating the last of the biscuits he offered. Her hands trembled, but her eyes had a spark again. "You're a kind soldier," she said softly. Halpern smiled faintly. "Kindness doesn't win wars. But maybe it ends them," she replied. The words lingered, catching the air like embers. When the fire dimmed, he went outside again. The light was fading, the sky bruised purple and gray. He stood alone by the doorway, staring toward the east where Mason's convoy had vanished. In the distance, the faint rumble of tanks rolled like a warning. He thought of his orders, of his oath, of the faces of men who'd followed him through hell. And then he thought of the small voice that had broken through all that noise, the child who had made him stop when everything else told him to keep moving. Inside, the girl began humming a lullaby, soft and wavering, filling the ruins with something fragile and human. Halpern looked once more at the horizon, at the faint glow of war receding. Then he slung his rifle, tightened his coat, and walked back inside. He sat beside them until the night thickened. The woman stirred once, whispering words he couldn't understand, but her tone carried gratitude. When the wind shifted, he heard distant shouting again. English, sharp, angry. Searchlights flared faintly through the fog. They were coming back. Halpern's pulse quickened. He glanced at the sleeping mother, the girl curled against her. The fire's last ember glowed between them like a heartbeat. He rose quietly, stepped to the door, and watched the lights draw nearer through the mist. His shadow stretched long across the broken floor. Somewhere behind him, the girl murmured his name, barely awake. He turned once, his voice barely more than breath. "Stay quiet, no matter what happens." Then he stepped outside into the darkness, rifle in hand, and disappeared into the fog as the engines closed in. The night was still burning when James Halpern ran. The fog that had protected them turned to smoke, thick and acrid, as the first flares burst over the fields. Engines growled in the distance, cutting through the silence like predators circling wounded prey. He could hear shouts, English voices carried on the wind. They were searching for him, for the deserter who had chosen mercy over command. Inside the farmhouse, the woman stirred, her fever deepening, her breath a shallow tremor. Lena clutched her mother's hand, eyes wide and shining in the flickering light. "Sir," she whispered when he burst through the doorway. "They're coming." "I know," he said, his voice low but steady. He grabbed his pack, his canteen, and the rifle leaning by the door. The fire had gone out, leaving only gray ash. "We have to move. Now." The child's lips trembled. "Mama can't. I'll carry her." He lifted the woman again, her body limp, lighter than he remembered. Each movement drew a faint moan from her throat, but he didn't stop. Outside, the air bit cold against his face. The eastern sky glowed faintly, dawn or artillery, he couldn't tell. He nodded to the girl. "Stay close. Don't fall behind." They crossed the fields, wet grass clutching their boots, every step a negotiation between exhaustion and duty. Behind them, the farmhouse was swallowed by mist. The sound of engines grew fainter, then stronger again. The war had no direction anymore, it just circled endlessly. Halpern moved fast, guided more by instinct than reason. He knew there was a medical division station somewhere near the Elbe, a temporary field unit that treated civilians when the chaos allowed. Maybe 30 miles, maybe more. The odds meant nothing. He'd stopped living by odds the day he first buried a friend. The woman murmured occasionally in her sleep, fragments of words he couldn't understand. Once, she whispered what sounded like "Fada," and he almost answered, though he didn't know why. The girl trudged beside him, her small boots sinking in mud, breath misting in the pale air. She didn't complain. Not once. By midday, the sky opened and rain began to fall, thin, relentless, cleansing nothing. They found an old cart road winding between forests and craters, once used by farmers before the war turned everything into strategy. Halpern's arms ached, his shoulders screaming with each step. He shifted the woman's weight, adjusted his grip, pressed forward. When they finally stopped beneath a grove of birch trees, the girl helped him spread the blanket. He laid the woman down gently. Her skin was hot, her pulse fluttering like a trapped bird. He checked the wound again. The infection had climbed higher. The air smelled of damp earth and blood. Lena sat beside her mother, whispering a lullaby too quiet for understanding. Halpern crouched nearby, listening to the rhythm of her small voice against the rain. For a moment, it felt as though the war existed somewhere far away, trapped behind the curtain of gray sky. He ate one of the last biscuits, broke the other in half and handed it to her. She hesitated before taking it. "Will Mama be better soon?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her. "She will," he said. Lies were easier to carry than corpses. When the rain eased, he wiped the mud from his rifle and checked the horizon. Smoke rose again to the west, columns like fingers clawing at heaven. He knew Mason's men wouldn't give up easily. Desertion was one thing, defiance was another. And there was no radio now, no friendly line, no flag that would welcome him back. They rested briefly before moving again, this time following a narrow riverbed eastward. The terrain grew rougher, filled with shattered bridges, half-buried vehicles, and the skeletons of forests burned weeks before. The girl grew quiet, walking a few steps behind him. When she stumbled, he caught her hand without turning. She squeezed his fingers once, small and sure. At dusk, they reached the edge of a village, if it could still be called one. Houses stood without roofs, doors without hinges. The wind carried the smell of soot and something older, abandonment. Halpern scanned the ruins, eyes sharp. The streets were empty except for a few stray dogs and the slow drip of rain through hollow windows. He found shelter in what had once been a church. The steeple was gone, but a few stained glass fragments still clung to the frame, bleeding color onto the wet floor. He set the woman down near what used to be the altar and built a small fire from broken pews. The glow brought faint color back to her cheeks. Lena sat cross-legged by the flames, her face flickering with orange light. "Did you have a daughter?" she asked suddenly. He paused, startled. "No, but you had someone?" He stared into the fire. The crackle filled the silence that followed. Finally, he said, "Once." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask again. Outside, thunder rolled like far-off artillery. The world was quiet except for rain tapping against stone. The woman's breathing had steadied, though her skin remained too hot. He unwrapped the bandage again, cleaned it with the last of the alcohol from his kit, and pressed fresh cloth over the wound. Her eyes fluttered open briefly. She looked at him, not as a soldier, not as an American, but as a man standing between her and oblivion. Her lips parted. "Danke," she whispered, barely audible. He nodded. "You're welcome." When she closed her eyes, he sat back and stared at the remnants of stained glass above. One fragment showed a child with open arms. Another, a lamb lying beside a sword. The colors shimmered against the firelight, trembling like memories refusing to die. He stayed awake most of the night, listening. Once he thought he heard voices, distant, distorted. He grabbed his rifle, waited. Nothing followed. Only the wind and the occasional crack of branches. By morning, the fog had lifted. The river shimmered silver beyond the broken walls. They needed to move again. The medical station, if it still existed, was somewhere beyond those hills. He packed quickly, shoulders already aching from anticipation. Lena helped him lift her mother, her small hands steady. The woman moaned once but didn't wake. They left the church behind, the fire's ashes still warm, a faint reminder that something human had passed through. They followed the river east, sunlight bleeding through the clouds. Every few miles, Halpern paused to rest, scanning the horizon. Abandoned tanks lined the roadsides like extinct beasts. Birds nested in the barrels of old guns. Life, stubborn and quiet, was reclaiming the ruins. As the day wore on, the heat rose. His muscles screamed. He shifted her weight again, sweat carving paths through the dirt on his face. The girl walked ahead now, singing softly to herself, guiding them by instinct more than direction. By late afternoon, the air changed, the smell of burning fuel, the faint hum of machinery. He slowed, motioning for the girl to stop. Through the trees ahead, the road widened. Across a narrow bridge of twisted iron, he could see movement, tents, vehicles, soldiers, an Allied medical division. Relief surged in his chest, fierce and sudden. He almost smiled. "We made it," he whispered. But then came the sound, gunfire. Not aimed at them, but close enough to echo. A small patrol of German stragglers, maybe, or desperate men with nothing left to lose. He crouched low, clutching the rifle tight. The woman stirred weakly in his arms, eyes fluttering open. Lena crouched beside him, whispering, "Is it over?" He looked toward the bridge. Smoke drifted lazily above it. The path was open, but only barely. If they waited, she might die. If they went now, they could all die. His breath came steady and slow. Every instinct screamed to stop, to think, to plan, but something deeper pushed him forward. He adjusted his grip, shifted the woman higher in his arms, and stepped toward the bridge. The planks groaned under his boots. The water below shimmered red from the setting sun. Each step felt heavier than the last. Behind him, Lena followed, clutching the strap of his pack. Ahead, the field tents waited, white and silent against the horizon. A shot rang out somewhere to the north. Halpern didn't flinch. He just kept walking. And as the wind rose, carrying the distant echo of sirens, he whispered to the child beside him, "Almost there, Lena. Just a little further." The bridge creaked again, threatening collapse. He took another step, then another, and from the far side of the river, a voice shouted his name. The voice came again, sharp and urgent through the smoke. "Halpern! Stop where you are." It cut across the roar of the river and the low rumble of engines. He froze mid-step on the twisted bridge, the woman's weight trembling in his arms, Lena clutching the hem of his coat. The world narrowed to the shuddering planks beneath his boots and the current flashing like molten glass below. Through the haze he saw them. Allied soldiers on the far bank, rifles drawn, confusion etched across their faces. Mason stood among them, his cap gone, his expression somewhere between fury and disbelief. "You're out of your mind," he shouted. "That bridge won't hold." Halpern didn't answer. The bridge creaked, sagging under his weight, But the field tents were so close now he could smell antiseptic and smoke, hear the faint hum of a generator. 1 more minute, maybe less. The woman's breath fluttered weakly against his neck. Her pulse was barely there. "Put her down!" Mason yelled again, stepping forward as if his voice alone could rewrite gravity. "She's not your responsibility." Halpern took another step. The plank beneath him snapped, plunging into the river below. Water sprayed up cold and sharp. Lena gasped, grabbing his coat tighter. He shifted, found balance again, and moved. His boots hit the next beam, slick with rain. The entire bridge moaned like something alive. He could see their faces now. Young medics waiting beyond the barricade, wide-eyed, unsure if they were witnessing rescue or suicide. One raised a stretcher. Another waved him onward, shouting, "Hurry, before it gives." Halpern drew a deep breath. "Almost there," he murmured to the child. She nodded, her small face streaked with mud and fear but holding the kind of faith he'd long forgotten existed. Then came the sound. A distant crack, sharper than thunder. A rifle shot. Splinters burst from the railing beside him. He didn't know if it came from a stray German sniper or a panic sentry, but it didn't matter. The bridge shuddered again, ropes snapping like whipcords. He lunged forward, throwing his weight into the final stretch. The last beam collapsed behind him as he leapt the final gap, hitting the ground hard on his knees. Pain seared up his leg, but he didn't let go. The woman slid from his arms onto the waiting stretcher, her head rolling to one side. Lena fell beside her, sobbing. Medics swarmed them instantly, voices blurring together. "She's still breathing. Get plasma." "What about him?" "He's bleeding." Halpern waved them off, stumbling to his feet. Mason was already there, mud splattering his uniform as he approached. "You're insane," Mason said quietly, his voice ragged now, not angry but hollow. "You could have died out there. You nearly did." Halpern wiped the blood from his brow, meeting his eyes. "She would have," he said simply. For a moment, neither man spoke. Around them, the camp buzzed with motion. Stretchers carried in, trucks idling, orders barked through radios. The woman was wheeled toward the tents, a medic pressing bandages to her wound. Lena walked beside her, gripping her hand even as the nurses tried to pull her away. Mason sighed, dragging a hand through his hair. "You know this isn't going away," he said. "There'll be a report." "Command won't." Halpern cut him off. "Do what you have to do." Mason looked at him, then at the child following the stretcher, and something in his face softened. "You're a damn fool," he muttered. "Maybe," Halpern said, "but a fool can sleep at night." The sky began to break open above them, pale light spilling through clouds still bruised from battle. In the distance, artillery echoed faintly, like the dying cough of a war that refused to end. Hours passed before anyone told him she'd survived. Infection reversed, pulse returning, stabilized under morphine and care. The doctor approached him quietly, his hands still stained with iodine. "She'll live," he said. "Barely, but she'll live." Halpern nodded once. He didn't smile, not quite, but the lines around his eyes eased. When he turned, Lena was there, holding something small in her hands. A locket, dented, its chain broken. She offered it to him. "Mama wants you to have it," she said softly. He hesitated, then took it. Inside was a faded photograph. A man in uniform, not German or American, just human, his arm around the woman, who now fought for breath inside that tent. On the back, a single word etched by hand. "Zurückkommen. Come back." He closed the locket, slipping it into his pocket. "Tell her," he said, "that someone finally did." Lena smiled faintly. "You're good," she said. "Mama says you have soldier's eyes, but a healer's heart." Halpern looked away, embarrassed by the words. "She should rest," he murmured. By nightfall, the river had settled again, carrying pieces of the shattered bridge downstream. The camp quieted, lanterns flickering like fireflies among the tents. Halpern sat by the water's edge, his rifle beside him, watching the current. Every war he'd fought in had blurred together, but this felt different. This had weight. Mason approached, holding 2 tin cups. "Coffee," he said, sitting beside him. "Figured you earned it." Halpern accepted it without a word. The first sip burned, grounding him in the simplest truth, that he was still alive. "Orders came down," Mason said after a while. "Berlin's days away from falling. Command wants us east by morning. I can't take civilians." Halpern nodded. "I'll stay until they move her. You know what that means, right?" He did. It meant being left behind, record scrubbed, career over. But none of that mattered now. He looked at the tents, at the faint silhouette of a child holding vigil beside her mother. Some things are worth staying for. Mason studied him, then chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "You never learned when to quit." "Neither did this war," Halpern said. They sat in silence after that, listening to the steady rhythm of the river, the sound of nurses murmuring in the distance, the occasional crack of a branch as night creatures returned to their world. When dawn came, Mason's convoy prepared to move. Engines roared to life, wheels grinding through mud. Halpern stood beside the tent, the woman sleeping peacefully now, the fever broken. Lena hugged him tightly, her arms fierce around his waist. "I won't forget," she whispered. He rested a hand on her head. "You better not," he said, his voice almost smiling. Then he stepped back, watching the trucks vanish into the mist, carrying away everything he'd once been. Years later, in a quiet farmhouse in Illinois, a letter would arrive. Its postmark foreign, the handwriting elegant and trembling. It would begin simply, "To the man who carried my mother through fire, I have never stopped remembering the weight of your kindness." But that was another story. For now, on that gray morning by the Elbe, James Halpern stood alone as the river whispered beneath the ruined bridge, carrying away the noise of war. And for the first time in years, the silence felt like peace.